Hello and welcome to Understanding Emotions. My name is Sankalp. In this episode, I have the legendary Professor Robin Dunbar join me. Professor Dunbar is emeritus professor of evolutionary psychology at the University of Oxford. He has won many awards. Some of them include the Fellow of the British Academy, Fellow of the Royal Anthropological Institute, the Huxley Memorial Medal, the foreign member of the Finnish Academy of Sciences and Letters, and so on and so forth. Professor Dunbar is probably most widely known for Dunbar's number, which is this idea that there is a theoretical limit on the amount of relationships we can have, and the most common one being 150. But as you'll see in this episode, it's not just that, and there are various layers and people who are in the innermost layer. There's like one or two people that you can have there, and it extends and so on. So Professor Dunbar is extremely knowledgeable about everything to do with relationships, friendships. We talk about friendships, we talk about relationships, we talk about how friendships are formed. Some of the fascinating research he has observed about how relationship formation takes place, the importance of having a shared sense of humor or a shared musical taste. We also talk about dating and relationships. We talk about what's attractive. We talk about what can people do to improve their attractiveness. We talk about relationship styles like monogamy, polyamory. So it's a really value-packed episode, and you'll see how well Professor Dunbar understands this field. We talk a little bit about the neuroscience of it as well, but if you need more on that, then I have a full episode on this thing, which will be linked down below. But without further ado, let's get this rolling, and let's speak to Professor Robin Dunbar. Professor Robin Dunbar, welcome to the show, and thank you for joining me. It's indeed an honor for a junior researcher like myself to be able to talk to you like this, and also I'm sure the listeners would like it a lot.
You're very welcome. Lovely to be here talking to you.
All right. So while studying for this interview, trying to research this, I saw that your expertise is so wide and so deep that it's kind of hard to choose a topic for me almost. But I do want to start with this one, which is you say in one of your articles that friendships are the single most important factor influencing our health, well-being, and happiness. And this is your 2018 paper in Trends in Cognitive Neuroscience for the notes out there. Could you just tell us why do you think friendships are so important?
Well, the short answer is we didn't realize they were that important, though I suppose intuitively everybody knows that. Mm-hmm. But the evidence of just how important friendships are for your health and well-being didn't really start to appear until 15, maybe 20 years ago, for the first time somebody mentioned it. But in the last 10 or 15 years, there have been huge numbers of papers and big epidemiological studies showing that the single best predictor of your mental health and well-being, your physical health and well-being, even how long you're going to live into the future from today, mm-hmm. is predicted by the number and quality of close friendships. And by close friendships, we also include family members as well as what you would think of as friends. Your close relationships, and that the optimal number there is 5. We see that over and over and over again. We've shown it with one study that I was involved in was looking at predicting whether or not you had symptoms of depression 2 years later. Mm-hmm. And again, and that was 13 European countries, a huge sample size, a very, very strong effect. The best study of all that I like because it's very, very hard-nosed. Most of these psychological studies, you kind of go, how happy were you yesterday? How happy were you today?
Yeah.
Or, rating scales. And of course, how do I know that your happiness and my happiness mean the same?
Sure.
This study looked at heart attack patients. What predicted whether you were still alive 12 months after your first heart attack? Mm-hmm. Right? So there's no argument here.
Right.
Either you're alive or you're dead. It's as simple.
Right.
Right? And the best predictor is the number and quality of close friendships. So that effect seems to be extremely strong. Mm-hmm. Of course, there's an interesting question about how you find people friends. Sure. In other words, if we want to solve the cost of health services, hospital services in any country, I guess, the solution is very obvious. You find everybody some friends.
Yeah.
That's a difficult problem. Maybe we'll come back to that.
Right.
The question is, why should that happen? And the answer, I think, is twofold. One is that the kinds of things we do with friends, like laughter, eating together, telling stories to each other, either sort of stories about ourselves or stories about other people's experiences and emotional crises and all these kind of things. Dancing, singing, all these things trigger the endorphin system in the brain.
Right.
And the endorphin system, being an opioid, it's chemically very similar to morphine, but it's just different enough that you don't get addicted to it. That, of course, lifts you. It gives you the same effect as morphine. It gives you this uplift. It makes you feel relaxed and calm and happy and contented and at peace with the world.
Sure.
And so, this is free antidepressant.
Sure.
But at the second phase seems to be that, and this is, we don't know this for sure, but there are now about half a dozen papers showing that what the endorphins do when they're released in the brain, because they're part of the brain's pain control system, that's what they're there for. When they're released into the brain and the bloodstream from the endorphin-producing neurons in the brain, what they seem to do is upregulate the immune system, and particularly natural killer cells, NK cells.
Right.
And NK cells
Right.
are particularly focused on viruses and some cancers. So you can see now maybe a link, a very simple biochemical link to how it might improve your physical health, not just your,
Right.
your psychological health. We can understand because it's just about doing stuff with your friends, right?
Right.
So it gives you that uplift. But now you can perhaps see a mechanism that might lead to a physical benefit as well. So.
Got
Yep,
it.
friendships are important.
Thank you for that wonderful description. And it almost takes like 9 out of the 10 things I had listed. So I'd love to go in depth in some of those things. But I just want to start with this anecdote about friendships being this antidepressant thing. So I did grow up with like maybe mild social anxiety is what someone would describe. And I enlisted the help with this of psychologists who asked me to, go out and talk to as many people as you can, make these acquaintances. It doesn't have to be super deep relationships. And I remember when I did those sorts of exercises, those were like the happiest days of my life. Like I was just elated. And this is someone who has like, I've never had alcohol. I don't drink caffeine as much. And I felt like I was on like drugs. It was ecstatic. So I guess the question is you spoke about friendships and you said there are 4 people, but there also seems to be this effect of acquaintances. So maybe we should spend some time in just defining what you mean by friendships and where does that number 4 come from?
We use the term friendship in the same way that Facebook actually does.
All right.
Ironically, simply because it doesn't differentiate types of friendship. So we would just differentiate between family relationships, maybe between family relationships and your in-laws, your friends of different kinds, your close friends, your acquaintances. We just wanted a term which covered all kinds of relationships. And relationships is a long and boring word to have to keep writing out. So friends was just a simpler term to use. So there's nothing special about it. It is just people you have meaningful relationships with. And so what we've done in some cases is to ask people to write down a complete list of everybody they feel they have a meaningful relationship with. But those were kind of like the original studies we did. They were also very long lists because some people might have 150.
Sure.
That's a lot of people to list down. But we've joined the 21st century and we do a lot of this stuff online. So you can look at Facebook pages, the number of friends people have on Facebook. We've done it on telephone databases. So we're looking at all the calls you make over the course of a year. So that's really what defines your meaningful relationships, is all the people you would like to contact at least once over the course of a year. And it turns out you can use any of these modes of communication, that, texting, phoning, Facebook, whatever, social media, face-to-face interactions. You get pretty much the same picture, which is a total network of about 150 people. But if you look then at the structure of those relationships, so if you look at how often each person is contacted, what you see in all these kinds of data is a very discrete pattern in which your friendships, as it were, are allocated to a series of layers around you. So it's a bit like, I always describe it in terms of when you throw a stone into a lake, the ripples that go out. If you think of yourself as the stone, you're surrounded by a series of ripples or layers, and the ripples get bigger and bigger, which means they include more and more people, but the height of the wave gets smaller and smaller. So the emotional closeness gets smaller and smaller. The frequency with which you contact them gets less and less. But those ripples turn out to have very, very consistent sizes right the way across populations. So they occur at 5 people, 15 people, 50 people, 150 people. And these layers are inclusive. So the 50 includes the 15 includes the 5 in the center. And it extends beyond the 150 to a layer at 500, which we label the acquaintances layer. So these are like a lot of the people you work with, maybe. They're people you would probably go and, I don't know, have a beer with, or a lassie or something, chat in the street on a table and chairs in the street, or you might perhaps go away for a weekend with for some reason or other, but you probably wouldn't invite home, right? That's the kind of big difference. The people you'd invite home is this 150 circle. Now, ironically, there's this interesting thing here in that turns out to be the average size of weddings in the Western world, 150, right? Very consistently. Of course, famously, as you well know, in India, it's more like 500.
Yeah.
So what's going on here? Well, it's not that those relationships don't exist in the West, but they do in India, let's say. It's whether you choose to have a very big wedding and invite these more peripheral people, for all sorts of reasons, economic reasons, social reasons, whatever, or you have it more confined to your extended family and friends. That's the only difference, because if you look at Facebook, you will see that 500 layer there. If you look on your most people's telephone bills, as it were, their itemized telephone bills, you'll see these other phone numbers appearing very occasionally, but very, very occasionally. So they all exist there. It's just that each of these layers, because they correspond to different intensity of relationship, you kind of choose, and that may be a little cultural specific, you choose who to invite to what, which party, So, right in the center is your romantic partner. That's a little layer of 1.5 in there, which contains a romantic partner. And it's 1.5 because women have an extra person in there called a best friend forever. Who is usually another woman, right? It's a platonic friendship. So that's why, on average, because there are 2 sexes, the average for the population is 1.5. But of course, you wouldn't invite everybody into that circle.
Got it.
Because you don't have time. These layers, those circles have been named a Dunbar graph by some very nice mathematicians in Assam, one of the Assam universities.
All right.
So I have a number and a graph.
All right.
But those layers have not only specific numbers, but they have very specific frequencies of contact. If you don't contact the person, each person in that layer, the right amount of time, the relationship will gradually die and they will drop down through the layers. And it takes about 3 years for somebody to go. Probably you're in a layer of 5 wouldn't change very much. That only changes about one person every 10 years. But the 15 layer, it will take, if you stop seeing somebody in your 15 layer for some reason, it takes about 3 years for them to gradually drift down from that layer, which is very close. It means you spend a lot of time with them. They're your main social partners, to become an acquaintance, somebody I once knew, but I kind of haven't seen for a long time. And I've kind of forgotten what they, what music do they like? I don't remember.
So I guess what you're describing here is these, because I know lots of listeners would not be familiar with the core concept of Dunbar's numbers, which is named after your cousin. It's as you were telling me earlier, it's named after you. So for listeners who don't know, there's this idea of having concentric circles, that some friends are like in your closer sort of circles, and then the romantic partner being the core most, and then it goes on and on. And then, as Professor Dunbar was saying, there's like specific frequencies with which we interact with these people. Is that a fair description of what Dunbar's numbers are?
Well, yes, it just gets very murky at this point, because Dunbar's numbers, in most people's understanding, I would say, refers to this figure of 150, which is the outer layer for the number of meaningful relationships you have. I kind of describe them, sort of person who'd be in there as if you bumped into the person at 3 o'clock in the morning in the departure lounge of Hong Kong airport, you would not feel embarrassed about going up to them and saying, "Hi, haven't seen you for a long time. How are you doing? Tell us what the news is." And because they know who you are, and they know where you sit in their social world, you know where they sit in your social world. So it has this reciprocity of relationship, and it has history. We've known you for some time. That seems to correspond to people who you would make an effort to try and make contact with in some way about once a year, at least. That would be the minimum.
Right.
And it turns out that this number is predicted by the size of our neocortex, off the back of an equation that applies to all.
Could you just say what the neocortex is for those who...
Yes. So the neocortex is the bit of the brain which has evolved out of all proportion during the course of primate evolution. So it's a kind of primate speciality. If you like, it's the smart end of the brain.
Right.
It's a very thin sheet. It's only about 6 or 7 centimeters thick.
Right.
But it's very big. So it occupies, if you spread it all out, an adult human neocortex is about 1 meter square, right? And the reason the human brain is sort of all convoluted and lumpy the way it is because it's trying to fit this huge sheet around the old inner core, if you like, and get it all matched up.
Right.
But it's the main processing units in there for managing, well, of course it does all the smart things we do, like arithmetic and predicting things and all these kind of things that are clever, smart vertebrate stuff. But in particular, the primate neocortex is expanded. So just to give you a scale on that, in very primitive mammals like voles, your neocortex is about 10% of your total brain volume. In the most socially and otherwise smart mammals that are not primates, neocortex size is about 40% maximum.
Right.
Primates start at 50%. In the most social primates, like monkeys and apes, and of course humans, it goes up to 80%. So 80% of your total brain volume is neocortex. Now, some of that kind of isn't very interesting from this point of view. So the visual system at the back of the head is pretty much routine management. It's nothing exciting. It's the front part, or the more frontal part, that's involved in managing social relationships, in primates in particular. And the bigger that is, and primate neocortex evolved from back to front. So when it's expanded at the front, not at the back.
Right.
And that's why we have these big domed foreheads. right, to accommodate this massive, great frontal lobe. So the number of, it turns out that the size of the neocortex, essentially in primates, predicts the size of social groups, and it predicts the size of about 150 for humans. If I remember rightly, the prediction is something like about 152, and the mean for a very large number of samples, some of which are millions of people in size, is 154.4. So it's very, very close. And we can show even that within individuals, people who have lots of friends have a larger frontal lobe in particular, because that's all been done by neuroimaging, so we can measure different parts of the brain. Rather than having to rely on this rather crude measure of the whole neocortex, we can partition it down a bit. It's really the frontal lobe, but it's a kind of more complex than that neurologically, because at the end of the day, it's the default mode neural network for those who are interested in these arcane anatomical details, which is this massive, great white matter tract that provides the wiring and the units that come off that, the grey matter computational units essentially come off that, and they're in fairly specific places. So it's not the whole brain as it stands, but as a proxy that works okay.
Got it. So so what you're describing essentially is what you did and what you discovered. The Dunbar's number big result was you looked at animals and you looked at their neocortex sizes and you compared that against the groups they were hanging out in, the size of the groups that they were hanging out. And then you realized that, look, you can actually extrapolate this and find a number for humans. You can trace that pattern and humans would follow, and you predicted that humans would have a group size of 150.
About 150,
150. And that's what
we
popular
see.
Dunbar number is.
So that would be considered the Dunbar number. Sometimes I say actually it's not Dunbar's number or the Dunbar number, it's Dunbar's numbers because of these layers. Right. And of course these layers go beyond 150. I mentioned the acquaintances layer up to 500. We know there's another layer at 1,500, and we know that there's one more layer beyond that at 5,000, because that was discovered not by us, but by some vision scientists who wanted to know something, whether there was a limit on the number of things you could recognize visually. And they took faces, and they came up with the figure of 5,000. As the limit on the number of faces where you could distinguish, have I seen this face before? Is it a stranger's face?
Got it.
Or have I don't know who it is, but I have seen it somewhere, right? And I just went, bingo, that's the next number in the sequence.
You have another ring now.
And it has to be the last one, because anything beyond that 5,000 is a stranger, complete stranger.
Wow. What are some interesting places in which you've seen this Dunbar's number popped up that you would have not expected to see perhaps initially?
I guess the one that most bemuses me, because it shows the whole sequence, is residential campsites in Germany. Right. So these are, if you go touring in Germany campsites, what you will often find is there's a small part of the campsite which is cut off, which are for permanent residents. Tourists are not allowed to live there, and usually they're people who have kind of, I guess it's a bit like a caravan park in America, trailer park, it's that kind of thing, because people have a caravan there and they'll make a little garden because they actually live there all year round. Anyway, it turns out that the size distribution, this is based on a complete sample, I think it's 1,500 campsites across Germany. The distribution of sizes corresponds to these layer sizes, 50, 150, 500, 1,500.
Right.
And these were designed long before we knew about the existence of these numbers. So I think what it's pointing to is that when the designers when they laid out, how many people should we make space for here? Right. They kind of intuitively had these numbers at the back of their minds. We're aware of them but we hadn't kind of formalized them, if you like. So
Got it.
It always reminds me of Richard Dawkins' famous observation that you know something is right in science when somebody tells you something and you go, oh yeah, I knew that. I just never realized it.
Right.
Right. So that's the difference. You know, we do these things and now here's the explanation for it, and it all kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
So I think that's the most weird, seriously weird one, because you would never have predicted that. And we weren't even, I wasn't even sure whether the graduate student that had the idea of looking at this, a German graduate student, it just seemed unlikely to me.
Sure.
It couldn't possibly be true.
Right.
But it turned out to be true. But there are all sorts of other kind of weird things, I suppose, in similar vein. I guess the most, in some ways, amusing one was about 10 years or so ago, 12 years ago, a paper was published which became quite infamous because what it was a study on Facebook where they'd manipulated people's news feeds in order to see what happened. Right? And then the paper got into a lot of trouble about you know, sort of deceiving subject.
Can imagine.
But in the middle of the methods, it says, now this is 61 million Facebook pages, right? This is not a small sample.
Right, yeah.
They give the average number of friends on Facebook pages, and it is 149.
Wow.
So on the strength of this, if I can collect $200 every time this comes up, right, I'll have enough money to buy both of Abramovich's yachts, because he doesn't need them. And all future podcasts will be done at my expense on my yacht in the Caribbean.
Yacht.
Don't worry.
It's hilarious. Yeah. Does this surprise you? Because, you know, we tend to think that nature has a lot of like gray areas and things, whereas this seems much more like discrete and much more boxed up to me. Does this surprise you, and does this tell you something about like the fabric of relationships? Or
yes, I mean it's about the computational limits that the brain imposes on the hardware of the brain, if you like, imposes on how we manage relationships. There's not a memory problem at all. You know, that's very clear. Well, if you like, the memory problem limit is 5,000. Yep, I've seen that face before, or I haven't seen that face before. But that's not a relationship. What a relationship about is being able to manage the processes, to understand the mind of the other person well enough that you can engage them in a conversation easily, because you know what things are interesting to them and to you, of course. So you can have a conversation, you know what their musical tastes are like, you know what their sense of humor is like, all these kind of things. And you can you know sufficiently how their mind works that if you like, you can compute what's the best way of dealing with them. So if you want to persuade them to go out and go clubbing with you or something, instead of sitting in and watching a boring film, which is what they want to do, right? You have to kind of machinate a little bit, you know, persuade them. And how you do that is a very complicated, sophisticated task. And that's what lies at the bottom of this. It's your ability to manage your mind state, their mind state, maybe their friends' mind states as well. You know, to persuade somebody of either, let's say, an argument, your position is the right position, or, you know, let's go out and do some social activity or something like that. That's the complicated thing, and that's what seems to be really limiting. It turns out that this all backs into mentalizing abilities, so what I call high-grade theory of mind. So theory of mind is just kids play. 5-year-olds can do it, right? Technically, it's your being able to understand somebody else's mind state. So it's what the philosophers of mind would have called second-order intentionality. So I believe something, that's first order. I believe that you think that something's the case, that's second order. You know, which is what most of the research has been done on this topic for the last 30 years, probably, or more. But actually, adult humans can manage up to fifth order. That seems to be the average limit.
I see.
But there's variation. There's a lot of individual variation. It's sort of the typical average, if you like, the neurotypical adult. Varies between about third order and maybe sixth order.
Got it.
So there's quite a lot of variation between individuals, and that variation correlates with the number of friends they have in that inner circle and in the next layer outwards, doesn't matter which you measure. It also correlates with their ability to understand stories, so people who can operate at sixth order, and we've done this with the same story written at third order and fifth order. So people who can handle fifth order intentionality enjoy a fifth order intentional story version of the story much better than the third order one, because that just sounds boring.
Right.
But conversely, the people who are kind of third order, naturally third order adults, kind of prefer the third order story because they find the fifth order story too complicated. There are too many minds. It affects the jokes we prefer. There's an upper limit of fifth order mentalizing in the structure of the joke. It also, we've shown recently, it affects which cartoons. I'm talking about political cartoons in newspaper, not Mickey Mouse, right? So, where there's a kind of punchline and something funny, as it were, being expressed, or some political point is being made, kind of ironically. Again, the upper limit on the complexity for those kind of forms of humor is again at fifth order, remembering that your mind state is one of those five. So lots and lots of things we do are limited by this capacity, and it is you can almost put down so many square centimeters of frontal lobe per mind state. That's what you have. And in turn, that same capacity underpins how complex the grammatical structure of sentences you can understand. So how many clauses can you link together? And also, as I say, it limits the number of friends you have. And I kind of see it in terms of the skills of a juggler. So, if you can manage fifth or maybe even sixth order, 20% of people can do sixth order mentalizing. So it's rare, but not massively rare. But it affects. If you think of juggling different mind states for a group, it's like the juggler keeping five balls in the air. If you're very skilled, you can keep five. If you're not so skilled, you can only do three.
Yeah, understood. So it's what you're saying is in like this chess of life, of understanding each other's moves.
Yes.
People might have better abilities to predict what the next moves would be and what my response to that social move.
Because if you have too many mind states involved, then it becomes impossible to keep track of what's going on. So we actually did a study of this with Shakespeare. We showed that Shakespeare always only has four people on the stage, maximum, talking. You may have some other people, soldiers, servants scattered around the edge, but the people who are in conversation, you only have four people, bearing in mind that the audience is the fifth mind state. But if they're talking about somebody off stage and they're talking about the person's mind state, he reduces it to three, so as not to overload. On the other hand, if they're talking about, the people on the stage are talking about some event that happened, or something that happened to the person off stage, but doesn't involve his mind state, he got murdered, something like that, then he has four people again on the stage. So he's very, very subtle. And we showed that was also true in a lot of film genre. And we also did a study of undergraduates at an American campus, where we had an American graduate student who'd been here, who had the audacity to rush up to people, look at a group, count how many people in the group talking, and then rush up to them and say, "What were you talking about? What were you talking about?" Right. And then figure out, we showed exactly the same thing happened. If they're talking amongst themselves, maximum of four people. If they're talking about somebody who wasn't there in the group, but it was just, I don't know how many home runs they hit in the baseball game on Saturday or some factual thing, four people again. If they were talking about that person's mind state that wasn't there, three people.
Wow.
So it's a really tight limit. And what seems to happen then is this reverberates through the system and creates this harmonic effect, which produces these layers. And we can show mathematically that actually those layers at 5, 15, 50, 150, and 500 are optima in terms of information flow around the network. If you're in between, the network works very inefficiently, but its efficiency for flow of information around the network, it's at its optimum at one of those numbers. And the peak is at 150, and then the numbers either side are kind of like harmonics fading away down towards zero.
Got it.
So it all hangs together in the most extraordinary way, which I would never have anticipated.
Yeah, it's so mind-blowing. It's absolutely, it blows my mind to think that this is true, and the fact that it's been shown to be true, not just the fact that it is true. There's so many directions I can go with this, but one colloquial understanding I have is, at least I've heard that women tend to have better theory of mind or better emotional and social skills. Is that true at all?
I never heard that.
Oh, really? I've been told that there are gendered...
It's true.
It's true?
Yes,
okay. All right.
I was saying, are we supposed to admit it?
Right. No, not at all.
Yes. So the difference, there is a very consistent difference we get in all our samples. It's not always significant, but it's always a positive difference, a small positive difference in favor of women compared to men. But the differences, let's say, would be in the order of the guy's peak, as it were, the maximum is maybe four to five levels of intentionality, whereas the girls might be 5 to 6.
Right.
So it's just one notch higher.
Right.
But that one notch gives you additional power in the network sense, because you'll find the same difference in the number of close friends. So the 5 circle will be 4 to 5 for the guys, 5 to 6 for the girls. There are all sorts of interesting questions one can ask about why that difference should exist, and we don't really know. I can offer some hypotheses, I guess, but we have no real idea.
Right.
But it does seem to be very, very consistent. But it also reflects the fact that these numbers themselves, or it reminds us, if you like, that these numbers themselves are not absolute. They're just the averages for the population. They're very consistent. You know, we have very large numbers of samples, and some of these samples, as I say, are very, very large numbers indeed, tens of thousands of people. We always get the same numbers for the layers, the same number at 150. But if you look at within the samples, there's a lot of variation between individuals. So some individuals, let's say, if you just to give you a picture of how much the variation is, if you just consider the Dunbar number of 150, the average is 150, the range of variation across individuals within a sample will be something in the order of 100 to about 250. And actually that is what the predicted range of variation is from the equations primate equations that we used. Right. So it's quite comforting to see that actually replicated in real life. And you know, the difference is, we understand what some of these differences are, because you know, one of those differences is the difference between the boys and the girls.
Right.
But there are differences as a function of aging. So your mentalizing competences increase. Yeah. From birth onwards, they increase. They hit the sort of adult number and stay constant. And then they decrease again, of course. And your social network does the same. Right. In parallel to that, there are differences in personality, principally differences between introverts and extroverts. So introverts would tend to be 100 to 150 would be their natural range for the Dunbar number. Extroverts would be about 150 to 250. Got it. And that goes back to, as we understand it, that goes back really to what they're trying to do in managing their social world. So introverts seem to prefer to invest heavily. So they've both got the same social capital in the sense of time available or emotional capital available. Introverts would prefer to invest more in each person so that they have a very strong relationship. So if they need some help, they can go along to somebody and say, could you come and help me with this, or lend me some money, or just talk me through this problem I've got, whatever kind of that social or economic help, and they will not be refused. So they're risk averse in effect, right? Whereas extroverts are kind of willing to trade on their social confidence, and they don't mind, if you come to you and say, can you help me out? And go, actually, I'm a bit busy at the moment. I've got this stuff to do. An introvert would be crushed and go, oh, it's the end of the world. Nobody will help me. An extrovert will just go, never mind. I'll just go and ask somebody else.
Right.
And so they don't mind. They'd rather have, like a social butterfly, they'd rather have many people they can use in this way. And of course, also, they're probably working much more on having access to information from outside the social group. So the more people you have, the more access to information from the wider world you end up with. So the introverts and extroverts are doing this, essentially doing the same thing, but in different ways, right? They're trying to manage the social world in a way that supports them and provides them with what they need. But they have different styles, if you essentially think of it in those terms. So this is these kind of effects that produce the variability in the size of each of the layers, actually, because the layers will be smaller proportionately.
Yeah. I guess all of the things we have been discussing is building up to this one question, which was also one of the more commonly asked questions, which is, how the hell do you make these friends? And if at all there is any science-based ways of knowing how to get someone from the outer rings to one of the inner rings. I know there are plenty of business people who offer advice on this, citing you, and saying that there are these number of points of contact you have to have. So I thought I would just ask you directly about it.
Yes. Creating friends, I guess, is all about engaging in these activities. So these are kind of what I took to calling our social toolkit. So there's a set of activities we do with friends which create these bonded relationships. And that does it through the endorphin system. They are laughter, so laughing together, singing, dancing, the rituals of religion, if you're religious, eating together, drinking stuff together, particularly alcohol, but I suspect also other astringent drinks, so coffee, because it's bitter, tea perhaps as well. These kind of drinks seem to trigger the endorphin system. We know that's true for alcohol.
Got it.
It's not the alcohol you get addicted to, really.
Yeah.
It's the endorphin effect, right? And lastly, telling emotional sub-stories. Right? So therefore going to the cinema or the theatre to see Shakespeare tragedies or weepy films or all these kind of things. Those kind of activities, it's the opportunity to do those activities. And therefore it is finding the space in which you're going to meet people to do that, right? So it's really about finding the appropriate environment. And I think that largely comes down to identifying things you're interested in and then finding, I don't know, you might think of as a club, right? And this is particularly important because the other side of, so the machinery side, the pharmacological side is the endorphin system that sort of creates these bonds. But there is a cognitive component, which is the social brain coming in again, neocortex effect, where our friends are very similar to us in their likes and dislikes. These are what I call the 7 pillars of friendship, which are like a supermarket barcode of 7 dimensions of friendship. The more of these 7 dimensions you share with somebody, the stronger the relationship will be, the longer it will last.
Right.
These 7 are speaking the same language, or even better still, the same dialect.
Right.
And particularly in a big language, like English, or I guess Chinese or Spanish, or so, international language where there are lots of effort, then it tends to be narrowed down. But even within England, the difference between Northerners and Southerners within England, never mind Scotland and Wales, just within England, is massive in the structure and of the grammar and in the words used. And you can tell immediately. Well, actually, I mean, it really is very, very narrow, because the social linguists showed way, way, way back in the 1970s that you could tell, if you knew the dialects of English from just England, you could tell immediately somebody started speaking where they were born within 25 kilometers, right? Because the dialects are so small. Right. So speaking the same language or dialect, I think that's mainly important because it allows you to have a conversation without having to explain stuff, right? You both understand all the words that are used. Coming from the same area, we think it is growing up in the same area, right? What's the first question Punjabis always ask abroad? Which village did you come from? Your family, you're not family.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, it's exactly that effect.
Yeah.
Right? Having the same career trajectory. So if you think about it, lawyers, if you look at lawyers' friends, they're all lawyers, right? And we used to think it was because nobody would speak to a lawyer. Why would you want to be friends with a lawyer?
Yeah.
It's not true. It's that they've got something in common to talk about. Because the same is true of doctors, the same is true of journalists, the same is true of academics, etc., etc., etc. And it's because you've got something in common that you can discuss important things about, cases or of interest and all these kind of things.
Yeah.
Having the same hobbies and interests, having the same worldview, which is a kind of mix of your religious views, moral views, and political views. So it's how you think the world works, or how it should work, how people should behave, right?
Yeah.
And then the last two, which are the interesting ones, is having the same sense of humor and the same musical tastes.
Lovely. Yeah.
Right. And they turn out to be particularly interesting because they don't sound as if they should be very important. But actually, it turns out that having the same musical taste is the best predictor of whether a stranger would make a good friend or not. Right? If you both like Led Zeppelin, I'm sorry, I'm very old. There must be some new groups since then. Yeah. You must be friends,
Right.
So what happens is when we meet people, we spend a lot of time, for the first time, we spend a lot of effort trying to get to know them, arranging to see them and stuff, go out with them, to see where they lie on this. And we've shown this on telephone data from 3 different continents, 3 different countries, so Italy, Britain, and the US, that when a new number appears for the first time in the call list, we can predict what layer of the Dunbar graph the friendship will lie in and how long it will last, simply on the basis of the frequency of calls in the first month to 6 weeks.
Wow.
So when you first meet somebody, it doesn't matter how you do it. You might do it by phone, you might do it on text, you might do it by email, or you might do it face-to-face. You go through this period of contacting them a lot, talking to them, if you like, in some way, just trying to get a feel for who they are. And then you kind of go, okay, this is definitely a 6 pillar friendship. So I'm going to carry on seeing them a lot. Or you kind of go, nah, this is a 2 pillar friendship. I'll just stop seeing them so often.
Right.
And remember, these pillars are all positive. There's no negative pillars here. It's 0 upwards.
Yeah.
So we go through that process. So you have to be in a position to allow yourself to do that.
Yeah.
Right. Otherwise, you won't. But the tricky thing is there are big sex differences in how relationships are formed and bonded, which will therefore what I can say, find the right environment to meet people with similar interests.
Yeah.
But what happens after that will depend on whether you're at the boys' end or the girls' end of that dimension.
Sure.
Because girls' friendships are very one-to-one. They have these phenomena called a BFF, a best friend forever, which are very intense platonic relationship, which sit in with their romantic partner.
Right.
And their friendships tend to be kind of dyadic. It's you to each of your five people in your inner circle. Whereas boys' friendships are very casual and less intense. And therefore, the relationships between the five, or the six of you, because it's five other people plus you in that inner layer, the relationships are much more smeared around. So it doesn't matter if somebody's missing. Right. So, and you see this in terms of, if one of your little group that hang out together goes off to Thailand forever, I've had enough, I'm going to be a Buddhist monk now in Thailand. Girls will be on the phone or Facebook or something, constantly trying to keep the friendship going. And boys will just go, oh, yeah, sure, it was fun when Jimmy was here. Now, who's next in line to become a member of the club? And they just get shoehorned into exactly the same position that Jimmy was. And, so out of sight, out of mind. That doesn't really happen with girls. So and this sort of goes back to the fact that the way men and women bond friendships is very different. So women, it really is conversation based.
Got it.
Because it's this emotional exchanges and so on. And therefore, what we've showed, and we run long-term studies to look at this, is when people move away from their friends, what keeps the old friendships going with the girls is investing extra time in conversational things. That might be on the phone, but it might be making the effort to go and see them. Conversation makes zero effect. I mean, absolutely zero effect on boys' friendships. And it doesn't matter whether it's friendships with boys or friendships with girls. More conversation, less conversation, absolutely flatlining, right? As to whether it will continue or not. What makes the difference to the boys is doing stuff together. Banging heads in the woods, right? Because they're these kind of little club-like things, groupings they live in, are really activity-based, so, they might, and you can see it if you look at Facebook. So you see this very nicely actually on Facebook. If you look at Facebook profile pictures, if it's got two people in it, it's almost certainly a girl's, right? And it will probably be her and her boyfriend, or girlfriend as the case may be, or her and her BFF, right? Aside, and it's if you remove all the, me as a baby with my mum picture, or me with my enormous motorbike, which is rather a common Facebook profile picture. So if you get rid of all those, just look at photos that have real people in. If it's got 3 or 4 people in, it's absolutely almost certain to be a boy page, and there will be 4 guys sitting on the hill looking down over Machu Picchu, mountain walking together. 4 or 5 guys crammed into the five-a-side football net, because they meet up once a week, or it'll be 4 or 5 guys sitting around the table, their pints of beer, or 4 or 5 guys in their kayaks on the lake. It's always activity based, and so conversation is irrelevant to that. And if you look at boys' conversations, what do they talk about? They don't know. If you ask them afterwards, if you ask girls what did you talk about this evening, they will tell you exactly. Right. My wife is always doing this to me when I'm out with my the blokes I go out occasionally and have a beer with. What did you talk about? I have no idea. Right? Because all it's about is making people laugh. Right? So the content is irrelevant. It's just making people laugh, because laughter is bonding. It floods the endorphins, gets you going.
How does a male-female relationship happen then? Do they find like middle ground, or a friendship? I mean,
this is an impossibility. Clearly, this is the $1 million question at the center of the universe. How does it happen? The answer is, and again, we've done a study of this, observational study of this. So men and women have very different conversational styles as well, right? How they talk when they're in a conversation is very, very different. This comes from social linguistics, way, way, way back in the 1970s, 1980s. women's conversations tend to have a lot of what's called back channel, which is sort of, oh yes, I know what you mean, constantly peppering through, right? They also tend to repeat the last part of the sentence just before the speaker stops speaking and to allow somebody else to speak. So they know exactly what the content of the conversation is. They know exactly what is going to come last. So they all repeat it in a kind of chorus. Their conversations are described as more collaborative in this sense, right? Boys' conversations are quite the reverse. In fact, they find that this back channel stuff, this repetition, very annoying because it sounds like you're interfering with their conversation. Their conversations never have any overlap at all, or very rarely. Back channels, it's called, these sort of yes, sort of I know what you mean type comments, very, very, very rare. So we did a study of what happens when you've got what look like romantic couples. So this was done in cafes, and the graduate student did them sitting at another table, and a young couple would come in, and she'd annotate. She wasn't recording, but she was just annotating what was going on in terms of these categories.
Sure.
And what she showed was that, and then she went up and asked them if they minded, and also how long had they known each other. It's a new relationship. Dynamics will be, of course, a little different. But what she showed was that the girls give way to the boys. So the girls adapt their conversational style to the boys because they're much more flexible. And I think this is one of the outcomes of having more mentalizing capacity. They're socially more flexible. And if you look at the way a lot of these things are processed, we've kind of done this, women tend to be handling relationships in several dimensions simultaneously, whereas I'm sorry to say that you and I, as representative boys, deal in a one-dimensional world. So we deal with one-dimensional relationships.
Right.
But it's sometimes I've been interviewed by journalists, and I've explained this to them, and usually on something like a sort of women's program. And they go, "Oh, that's so sad." And I go, "Yeah, but it's much easier. It's less complicated."
Sure. Yeah.
So there are trade-offs. I mean, back again to slightly the difference between introverts and extroverts. There isn't a kind of nirvana where everything is perfect. It's a complicated world, and there are many dimensions to it, and you have to choose. You can't do everything simultaneously and get the perfect solution because it just can't be done. It's too complicated. So different groups of people, different sexes, different personality types, whatever, are focusing on the components that are most important to managing their social world, and that's then how their social style is designed. So one isn't better than the other. It's just different ways of coming to the same solution. It's the old Buddhist mantra, there are many paths to the top of the mountain.
Right. Very nice indeed. In fact, that was going to be my question about, is this just descriptive that you're observing these things, but maybe there is some strategy that leads to better friendships, and maybe men just have historically, for some reason or the other, not caught up, let's say, or is this just differences?
I suspect, these are pretty hardwired because you see much the same kinds of differences in socializing in the very social monkeys and apes. So, the baboons of Africa, the macaques of Asia, as the most social of the monkeys, but also the chimpanzees and even the gorillas and so on. But the chimpanzees particularly, you see exactly the same differences between the sexes. So I suspect these are very deep because these species live in very complicated social systems in which you've essentially got two different objectives being married together. And you have to, what makes those then complicated is managing those two together. Because if you don't get the other person's perspective correct, the thing isn't going to work, right? The community will fall apart. The way these, both in these, both in these very smart monkey and ape societies and in human societies, if you cannot integrate individuals with different objectives and styles, it isn't going to work. Right?
Yeah.
And we'll go and live on our own in caves or something like that. So to be able to live in the kind of society to do, we have had to, or our ancestors have had to find ways to manage that. And that's part and parcel what mentalizing is all about. That's kind of why that's evolved, along with another important trait, and that's peculiar to the monkeys, the anthropoid monkeys and apes and humans, and that is inhibition. Right? The capacity to inhibit prepotent actions, as psychologists would call it. That's to say, not to take the last big piece of cake on the plate, but to wait politely to see if anybody else would take it first.
Sure.
Right? It's that capacity to step out. This is the famous marshmallow experiment that was done with kids in the 60s or whenever it was. That capacity is peculiar to monkeys and apes. Other species actually do not have it, and it depends on a particular bit of the brain right here in the frontal pole, just between your eyes, or just above between the middle of your eyes, that it only exists in monkeys and apes and humans, doesn't exist in other species. So it forms a part of the complex, and it's important because it allows you to engage in what you might think of as the skills of diplomacy, right? Rather than saying, nope, I want this, I want the biggest piece, give it to me. Now, okay, some people behave like that, and usually they end up with not many friends
Right.
as a result. But if you want friends, you have to be able to kind of engage in this kind of diplomacy. That's what it is, and negotiation, and not to be too demanding and too presumptive. And some people are better at it than others. Both, I'd say, girls seem to be better at it than the boys, for whatever historical reasons. I don't really think it's anything to do with their upbringing at all. But within girls and within boys, some everyday experience tells us that some people are more accommodating,
Of course.
and more fun to be with than others. So I'm sure you can tweak these a little bit with socialization and learning, but the basic difference is, very, very deeply rooted, I think. But they're absolutely crucial to our ability to maintain and live in these very large, complex societies that we have.
Got it.
Never mind your friends,
Yeah, I'm being mindful of time, so I do want to turn the chapter to another important topic that has been requested a lot, which is the innermost circle of the romantic partner, and dating and relationships on the romantic front. So I think what I want to start with is just first with that idea of one person. And some people have asked me to ask you about things like polyamory or online dating, and this optionality that we apparently have in this digital world. So just could you first comment on polyamory or online dating and this idea of the one?
Polyamory certainly happens, and it's not new. It's very ancient. It's been there for a long time.
Yeah.
I am not sure it is quite the same thing as a romantic partner. Now, it may well be that some people, well, I guess it is absolutely true. We've known this since the beginnings of history, if you like.
Yeah.
Some people are more monogamous and some people are more promiscuous. And that has a lot to do with, well, we've actually shown that difference in both men and women, can be estimated from the infamous 2D, 4D ratio. It's the ratio of your index finger to your ring finger, right? That correlates very highly with fetal testosterone,
Right.
Which drives, it's just a correlate.
Right.
But what it does is reflect the testosterone environment that you were bathed in as a fetus, as it were. And it high levels of testosterone then tend to make more promiscuous individuals, and less testosterone tend to make more monogamous individuals. So we do partition into these two different kinds. They're actually about 50-50 split, right, in each sex.
Yeah.
They tend to be slightly more monogamous based in women and slightly more
Got it.
promiscuous in men, but it's not the case that all men are promiscuous and all women are monogamous,
Right.
But because there's a kind of average of about 50-50. So yes, I mean, I don't think that's anything terribly new, to be honest. People have always done these kind of things. And, I suppose if you look at small-scale traditional societies, what you tend to find predominantly, we're used to living in particularly under the Abrahamic religions, at monogamy, especially Christianity, somewhat less so obviously for Islam, but we tend to look at monogamy as the norm, and in some sense it isn't the norm in ethnographic small-scale societies. It tends to have to be imposed by legal means, right? So formal marriages, and you're only allowed to have one at a time. So you might argue, well, polyamory, really is just, polygamy writ large, if you like, formally. Polygamy occurred one husband and many wives because that's the way it was legislated for in some societies. Occasionally, some societies the other way around, right? Yeah. They have polyandry. They have one wife and several husbands. Yeah. So the Tibetans, for example. In most of those societies, particularly polyandry, the women find very hard to do.
Right.
So in traditional Tibetan culture, women were allowed to go crazy once.
Right.
Seriously crazy. They would do crazy things like running along very high walls.
Wow.
So if they've, narrow walls around the edge of a monastery and over a massive gorge, if they miss their footing, they would be dead.
Oh, wow.
And just go absolutely crazy because they need to get their heads sorted out from these bloody men.
Wow.
Because what they marry is a brotherhood, right? A set of brothers.
Right.
And of course you start to get, when they're first married, it's fine because the oldest brother is, I don't know, let's say 21, 22. The second brother goes in the monastery always because he's also interested in the girl. So they make sure there's no competition. The next ones are too young to be interested because the youngest one may be 5, 6, 7, right? But eventually they all mature and they all get interested in the wife. And then she has this constant harassment and a hard time trying to keep the peace. And if you look at polygamous marriages the other way around, one husband, many wives, again, it is a very complicated arrangement. There's constant stress. And if you look at kind of people like the Mormons, some sects of whom are still polygamous as they originally were, majority are monogamous now, but some of the breakaway sects are polygamous. The men say you have to be very even-handed because otherwise it just causes trouble.
Right.
It's extremely difficult to manage.
Right.
So you see in African cultures, for non-sororal polygamy, let's say where the wives are not sisters. If the wives are sisters, they can all live in the same house.
Yeah.
If the wives are not sisters, each wife has a separate house round the compound.
Right.
And the husband has to go from one to the other. Monday this one, Tuesday this one, Wednesday, and he gets dinner and sleeps, next one dinner, and so on, to maintain an even hand. Otherwise, it creates a lot of friction. So there is an argument at one level for monogamy being less frictionable, if you like, but probably that is true because what these relationships are all based on is pair bonding. Problem is pair bonding is not permanent. Tends to last for varying periods of time. Famously, the average is 7 years, right? And then it either they start shouting at each other and they divorce, or they just kind of live like boyfriend and girlfriend, if you like, or just friends.
Friends.
It becomes less of a romantic relationship.
Right.
So you might, and that's what you see in hunter-gatherers a lot, is that they may have 10 or 11 partners in a lifetime, but at any one time, only one.
Right.
So it's serial monogamy rather than polyamory in that
Got
sense.
it.
So question then is, if this is a pair-bonded issue, an intense pair-bonded issue, and there are all sorts of things that happen in these intensely pair-bonded romantic relationships, is, for example, that bit of the brain that is critical of other people and things around you shuts down.
Right.
With respect to this person, right? They become a big halo around their heads. They're wonderful. They're perfect, right? And it takes a long time for that halo to be rubbed away. The longer the halo effect lasts, or the bigger the halo effect, the longer a romantic pairing will last. That's been shown, for example. And it tends to be if you have lots of things in common. So you share many things on the 7 pillars of friendship. But the big issue is that intensity of that relationship. So my guess is, yes, you can have polyamory, fine, but the relationships individually are not terribly intense.
Got it.
Right? And the reason is, and what we've shown with actual data, is that, so we did a big sample, and it's an object lesson for postdocs here and graduate students. We were trying to find out how long relationships lasted, and why people fell out, what caused the end of friendships and relationships, not just romantic relationships, friendships in general. When people really fall out with each other, I'm never talking to you again, what causes it? And the postdoc who did it was an online survey, did the survey, came back to me afterwards and said, I put it up, and I put in an extra question, which says, do you have an additional romantic relationship in addition to a lover, in addition to your official spouse? Right?
Sure.
What on earth did you do that for, stupid boy? Right? Because the problem with surveys, if you put too many things in, people get bored.
Yeah.
And they just kind of stop doing it, or they just reply at random.
Sure.
Secret is to keep it short.
Sure.
Every extra question that's unnecessary is
a
problem. Well, when the results came back, it was I had to give him $1 million clearly, because it was absolutely beautiful data. When people had an extra pair romantic relationship, a lover, their existing official spouse was not in their inner circle. They lived with them, but they'd been pushed out and replaced by the lover. The lover was the close romantic relationship. The official spouse was who you lived with, right, and did all this other stuff that you have to do with them. But also what came out of that, which was really interesting, was that, and primarily we were interested here in the inner core 5 relationships. People who were in a new romantic relationship only had 4 people in that circle. So our interpretation of this is that when you meet a new person, a prospective romantic partner, they're not somebody you already know in your inner circles.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
Because, if only because half of those are your close family, your mom, your dad, your brothers, your sisters, grandma. These are not people you normally fall in love with.
Yeah.
So there's somebody who comes from outside the solar system,
right?
Outside your layers.
Yeah.
They come in, and you've already got 5 people in the center. You've now added somebody new. That gives you 6.
Right.
So the whole thing is under time stress, emotional stress.
Right.
What happens is they get rid of 2, because this new romantic person is accounting for double time, right? Because they come into that 1.5 circle. That 1.5 circle gets much more time than the other 3.5 people that make up the rest of that 5 circle. So you invest very heavily in them, so heavily early on in a relationship that you don't actually, this is a strongly pair-bonded relationship. This is why I think these polyamory relationships, by and large, aren't of this kind.
Yeah.
Right. There's nothing wrong with them. Just they're not that kind of romantic relationship. Because if they're that kind of romantic relationship, they become absolutely absorbing, and all your time is committed to them. And the only way you can cope with that is to get rid of or demote some of your best friends and family to the next layer. And the question is, who do you throw out? Right? You've got 6, you've got to throw out 2 to bring it down to 4, because you're giving double time to the new romantic interest here. Who do you throw out? You could throw out your 2 family members, or you could throw out your two of your friends.
Yeah.
Well, your 2 friends are the people that are going to give you emotional support. Because, family members, yes, they're very good. They will always be there. When everybody else fails you, they will always come to your support. But they're absolutely hopeless when your relationship breaks down and you go home crying, and I say, what's the problem? And they say, he's abandoned me and left me. And what do they say? Instead of giving you comfort, which is what your friends would do, cheer you up and so on, they say, oh, well, there's plenty more like him out there. And anyway, we never liked him. So.
Right.
So it's absolutely useless. Absolutely useless. You need your friends, but you also need your family. What people actually do is sacrifice one of each. So this is so subtle. They keep keep one of each. So they've always got those 2 kinds of support network components, and sacrifice 2, and they only demote them to the 15 layer. So they can bring them back in later when the romantic relationship cools and doesn't take up so much time, which may take 5, 10, 15 years. It varies. Then you can bring those friends back in, for sure. But in the meantime, it's just a reflection of how costly these strongly pair-bonded relationships are. The data are very clear. The more bonded you are, the stronger the relationship is, and the longer it will last, as a solid relationship. And the problem for all of us is we only tend to live our life year by year and not take the long view. Right? So you tend to see how things are in the short term, and it looks all very rosy and stuff now, but next week it'll be gone. The answer is no. If it's a really strongly bonded one, it'll actually stick against all these kind of ups and downs for quite a long time. But that how long probably depends on personalities as much as anything, how much you had in common.
Sure. Yeah. I understand from a lot of Dr. David Buss's work and some others that there are very solid gender differences, especially in the realm of making new partners, sexual partners, and that so I just want to ask you, is this correct that a lot of what's attractive to men would be more on the visual side, more perhaps fast processing, that sort of a thing, and what would be more attractive on the women's side is more on the personality, or resourcefulness is a word that's thrown around?
Yep. And this is something we did a lot of work on many years ago now, looking at Lonely Hearts ads, personal ads, which were a very nice little summary of what you're looking for and what you have to offer. So it's like a little trade, barter. And they're very illuminating. There's lots of interesting things about them, because it's very clear that by and large each sex understands what the other is looking for, and therefore they adjust their bids and their demands accordingly. But what you can demand changes across the life cycle as a function of circumstances, and it's does so in different ways in the 2 sexes. But I guess in this context, the bottom line is that if you look at what the 2 sexes are asking for, very characteristically, males exhibit an interest only in what are essentially cues of fertility. So their physical attractiveness and age. And therefore women specify those unless they're old, because what tends to happen is men seek in these ads women of approximately the same age, so mid to late 20s, no matter how old they are.
Right.
Whereas women consistently seek for men who are about 3 to 5 years older than them. So they specify the age range they're looking for, and that's what you see very consistently. I'm not sure if I should tell you this, but the women win. Because if you look at the average age difference of marriages, it's the men are 3 to 5 years older than the women. So the women eventually get what they want.
Right.
And the men don't. Conversely, and that's because the argument is from evolutionary psychology is because it's really driven by the fact that the only thing that mammals in general can do to increase the number of offspring contributed to the next generation, therefore affect their genetic fitness into the future, is to maximize the number of offspring they sire and therefore the fertility of their marriage partner. Because if you marry somebody who's too old, they won't have such a long reproductive career.
Right.
Whereas what women are much more concerned about, so the men are kind of more concerned, or the males in general, more concerned about maximizing numbers of offspring sired or born. Whereas what females are much more concerned about is number of offspring successfully reared to adulthood. So they're playing two kind of different games. So in the context of humans, then what you see with women is they tend to de-emphasize physical attractiveness. Not that it's uninteresting, but they tend to de-emphasize it and tend to emphasize a suite of things. So you kind of look at the males' choice spaces, and they're very one track, very one dimensional. If you look at women's, they're several dimensional, because what they're trying to do is get the best environment. They tend to be looking for commitments, cues of commitment. So you're going to stay there and help, change the nappies and do all these things. Take the boys to play football, take the girls to the swimming pool, whatever they do as they grow up. Do all these kind of things around the house, knocking walls down, putting new things in, all these kind of things you're supposed to do. Cues of commitment, kind of wealth and status, these are kind of interchangeable. But because what's important in the rearing years is essentially at the end of the day how much cash there is in the family bank, as it were, to pay for all the things the kids need, whether it be schooling, ballet classes, swimming lessons, fancy toys, whatever, when they get older, cars. All these kind of things that parents have to buy, Nike shoes, all these kind of things, constant expense. So that tends to come up very strongly. Let's see, there's typically a third one, I can't think what it is, but it's essentially what they're looking for is resourcing, commitment and ability over time. And you can see these spelt out, certainly in the older ads, in very, very subtle ways, because they're trying to appeal to a certain kind of person, right? So you'd often see London postcodes given instead of a place. So, or it'll be just something like a subtle hint like Jaguar driving man, meaning I've got plenty of money, don't worry. Or, I live in WC1, WC1 male. Right. If you don't live in London, you don't know where that is, right? And then you don't matter. I'm not interested in you. Right.
So these are ads women are posting for.
And both ways. I mean, they're just both ways of being very subtle because they're trying to narrow it down because they know, what they're looking for is a certain kind of person.
Got it.
And the kind of person will recognize these very subtle signals. So WC1, that's very upmarket. You don't have to tell me that's Chelsea or somewhere like that. Whereas if you, put East End of London or something, that's down market. That's the kind of poorer end of London. Then, but you don't want to say that, and you don't want to boast. You have to be careful not to boast. So you do these very subtle little cues, and sometimes they're so subtle. When we were doing this stuff, and we were doing it on the ads in newspapers in London, the London newspapers, the local newspapers, and things like that, and so on, magazines. Some of them were so subtle, even we didn't understand them. We had to go and find somebody who lived in there, because we were all from somewhere else except London, so we didn't understand the codes. So sometimes these things will be very, very subtle. But what it's reflecting is this rather clear capacity that women have over men to be able to manage many more dimensions to their relationships. It bears back to what I was saying earlier. We actually show that, in terms of, you do a path analysis of how they're holding the decision processes they're going through just on ordinary everyday things, not necessarily romantic relationships. Men's tend to be more kind of one track, and different dimensions are actually separated in the path analysis, whereas women's, they're interlinked, and it means they're thinking about the consequences of their actions in the way that men don't do. So you will get kinship effects and personal benefits, let's say romantic relationship, personal benefit, will be completely separate components of a decision which aren't related to each other for men.
Right.
And women, they'll be interlinked because they're going, yes, I like him, but will all my aunties also like him?
Sure. So does it follow from this that it's not as straightforward for men to know how to improve their attractiveness towards the other gender? Perhaps it's more straightforward the other way around.
I think it is more difficult. Right. Yes, that's certainly true. And I think men often make mistakes because they overinterpret what the signals that women give, which partly it's because we don't, even in the modern world, in Western Europe and America, the two sexes don't actually mix that much. If you look at people's social networks, 75% of men's social networks are men, and 75% of women's social networks are women. And the other 25% that are the opposite sex are family. And you have no choice.
Got it.
Right?
Got it. Yeah.
They're just there because they have to be there.
Right.
When you're making a choice, our networks are very, very highly gendered. And those percentages remain constant from the age of 5 to the age of 85 in our data and other people's data. Loads and loads of data from lots of different European countries on the gendered structure of social networks. So we're talking about the 150 layer now.
Yeah.
So that we spend most of our time engaged with people who are like that. That's part of this homophily effect. We like people for most of our friendships, the people who are very similar to us. They're the same sex, they're the same personality, they share more of the 7 pillars. They're the same age as us. They tend to be the same ethnicity as us, and so on. And these, and by ethnicity, I mean, they come. We're both from this village, not that one. This is Punjabi stuff. We're so drawn to this homophily effect, and I think it's simply because it just makes the interaction easier to work with. You don't have to work so hard. You don't have to explain the joke. You don't have to kind of go, I'm going to say something, but before I say it, let me explain the backstory. Right. If you share lots of culture, I guess it is what it is, they're culture. And they're things we learn. I mean, the 7 pillars are cultural. We learned them mostly probably during our teens, when we learn how to be a member of the community, right? That's what we're learning, is essentially the 7 pillars. Of course, they change slightly because they're cultural, they change slightly as you get older and you meet different kinds of people, you try different kinds of things, experiences, but still you have this root base, and we actually think it harks back, to the village you grew up in, literally, because there's something immediately warming and positive if you meet some stranger and it turns out they're from your village in England, the Punjab, North America, wherever. Same village, immediately you feel some connection. We trod the same streets, we went to the same cafes. Right? Maybe that was a generation later, but I know what you're talking about. So conversation's easier. everything works. You understand what I'm talking about. I don't have to explain anything to you. It just makes things flow better. And so, there's an inevitable, if you like, sifting of friendships that goes on. And probably, if you didn't do that, life would be impossibly complicated. You'd go crazy trying to keep track of everything. But the fact you can, if all your friends are the same, it just makes it easier to handle because it's really one friend, right? It's not 5, it's 1. Because they're all the same. So you don't have to sort of go, oh no, if I say this, well, the other one, take it the wrong way or something like that. So having that kind of similarity, really in the end, kind of for better or for worse, that there's no such place as nirvana in this life, or in biology, as they say. There's no perfection. Right, everything has a good side, and then there are some negative consequences. And one of those negative consequences is then you grow up in a world of boys, as I guess we did mostly. I mean, you might have sisters, you may have, been to school with girls, but we've looked at school networks. Big study we did in Spain over several years. And you can just see the boys and the girls. These are 14-year-olds. They don't talk to each other. They just don't. So you when it comes then to the romantic time, you're in this situation where actually you don't really know how that group of people think and work terribly well. And in some sense, you can never do that because the only people you ever know really well is yourself, right? It's impossible to know. You can't get inside somebody else's mind except kind of indirectly, and that takes a lot of time and effort with them, and even then it's imperfect. So your best guide is what you do, which is what everybody tends to do, and of course it's a mistake. We assume everybody else thinks the same as us, and then we get into trouble. But you also see lots of consequences of just behavior in this context where boys particularly misunderstand what the girls are signaling. So girls tend to smile much more than boys do. So if you just watch men and women, any age, doesn't matter, in a kind of reception type environment where they're just meeting, talking to each other, meeting in groups and splitting up, meeting in groups, splitting up, just watch them and you'll see the women are smiling much more at the men. When the men are talking to them, they're smiling at them, so on. The men almost never smile back, right? And the problem here is what this is kind of girls, if you like, cooperative conversational style. So they do it with each other. It's encouraging, carry on speaking, I'm paying attention, right? And the boys think they're showing sexual interest, right? And they mistake it completely. And then well, are you going to come out with me now? And the girl goes, what do you mean? I never said.
Right.
All those
Where did that come from?
Yes. And you see this, I mean, this is one of the strongest effects you'll ever see, is sexual segregation in conversations. So there's up to conversation, so there's a very, very strict limit on the number of people that can be in a conversation together, 4 people. Right? If it gets more than 4, 2 things only can happen. One is everybody else shuts up and lets one person talk, so it becomes a lecture or a tutorial. Right? Or it breaks up. And it'll break up with it. If there's a conversation of 4 people and a 5th person joins, within a minute, that will be 2 conversations. And although that would, let's say there were 4 people in the original conversation, 2 boys and 2 girls, and they're all talking to each other. Soon as, let's say, another girl joins or another boy joins, it will split into 2 sex-based conversations. So it's another girl joins, so 3 girls, 2 boys. 3 girls will start talking to each other and 2 boys will start talking to each other. They just separate out. It's extraordinarily robust. A number of people that have come to me and said, I've watched this happening. It's so regular. If you just watch it in a social environment, any kind of social environment where people go, weddings or parties, anything like that. Well, no, parties are different. have a different purpose.
Sure.
Just sort of general social environments. It's so regular. It's just uncanny. And I think it's because conversational styles are so different that it is really hard work to have a cross-sex conversation. You have to, when there are lots of people involved, it becomes too difficult to do it. And you just kind of go, no, I'll just talk to my sex. It's easier.
Right.
Right. And that causes it to split up. And I think, in other words, not only when we grow up, do the boys not really play a lot with the girls and the girls not really play a lot with the boys, but even as adults, at the slightest opportunity, we just segregate out into the two gender groupings, as it were. So all the way through life, your exposure to social life is almost always to just this one gender. It's very hard to know how you can change that. It's clearly not learnt, because even people who are forced to go to school with the other gender do it.
Right.
You can try and engineer it, it just doesn't work. And it's because deep down these very, very striking, it's the difference in social style that is at the root of these things. So
got it.
So yes, I mean, it's not easy. And the great question you have to ask is, well, if they're so different, how on earth do we manage to create romantic relationships that last more than 30 seconds? Right?
Yeah.
And the answer goes back to the extremely efficient management by the girls, who are much more flexible in being able to kind of manage things. And they have a longer term view as well, right? Boys tend to be short horizons, thinking only about tomorrow, whereas the girls are thinking about next year. So, and they can trade off much better than the boys can the costs and the benefits. So they're much more likely to go, I'll give this up because in the long run, I'll get what I want. I'll trade a short-term loss for a long-term, whereas boys seem to be less good at doing that. But at the end of the day, I suppose the bottom line is, well, these relationships kind of don't last forever. And if they arrive at some kind of, what's as a term for it, which has escaped me, for these sort of older, where romantic relationships go to, as it were, the companionship, that's the word, they become companionship. So friendship rather than romantic in that sense, then that's a stable state. But otherwise, they're just, they're kind of almost inevitably part company and start again.
Right. Sure. Yeah, I mean, thank you for that fascinating description. There's so much I want to dig deep into, but I also want to not take too much of your time. So I'll just ask one last question and then we can conclude, which is, what do you think about the proliferation of online dating? So a lot of, or even like online friendships, I suppose, because whatever we were talking until now, a lot of it has been present across time, like, friendships or relationships or polyamory or monogamy. But one thing that is undeniably new is this online matchmaking or online dating and these kinds of things. So how has those apps, the swiping apps, changed how we form relationships and us?
Okay. So I think I'll sort of back off the romantic relationships bit, because we've never really done any work on that side of in a digital context. People have kind of looked at those kind of things, but it's not something I've kind of kept up with. But what we can say, and I kind of see romantic relationships and friendships, these close friendships, right? Maybe not your casual friendships that you catch up with once a year, as it were, but that close group of friends that you spend all your social time with. The processes involved in forming relationships are very similar to romantic relationships. So it's a courtship process again. So it's like I say, you do these kind of assessments. What are the fit on the 7 pillars like, for example? And the same thing is going on in forming romantic relationships. There appear to be a series of steps where you go so far in the relationship and then you step back, metaphorically as it were, and go, do I like it? Do we go to the next step, or shall I just leave now?
Yeah.
Right. And there are about 3 or 4 steps that go through. They start with distance cues, which are what these things like gender and ethnicity and age and so on, that group of biological homophily components are. They're what you see across the other side of the room when you open the door and go into the room, right? And you make a judgment. Go,
Right.
oh, that one looks interesting. I'll go and start a conversation, right? Or you say, maybe not this room. I'll go to,
Sure.
where's the bar?
Right.
Right? Go and find somebody else to talk.
Right.
And then, so if you decide to go and start a conversation, now you're starting to measure up. So it goes from conversation. The next step is physical contact, maybe some dancing or kissing or something like this, or kissing would probably be a second step, and so on. And gradually the relationship is, you're kind of assessing, going forward, assessing, going forward, you get to the right place. So that whole process of kind of courtship is true of all these relationships. Now, there's one important key to that, and that is, as you go through that process, you have to switch off the critical faculties or it's not going to work. Right? So 2 things happen. One is what would normally happen for all of us is you'd kind of sit on the fence. You know? You go, should I go and talk to this person? What if they say no? Right? And you can't make up your mind, and you never quite get there and you never quite go away. Right? And so you have to have something in your brain switched off, the caution, as it were, which says maybe not, or maybe I get rebuffed, I get rejected. That has to be switched off. So you're thrown off the fence, and you go and grab them in your arms and say, "Will you marry me now?"
Right.
And you may be lucky, and you may not.
Yeah.
But the point is, you throw caution to the winds, right? So you have to have something that switches that critical faculty off. And also, at the same time, you have to have, that also seems to bring into play this rosy sunglasses effect. So you start to exaggerate the characteristics. Now, this is very clear what happens on the internet, and the place to look is romantic scams on the internet, right? Before I talk a bit about that briefly, the other thing I might just add at this point is, if you look at, because we were really interested, did the internet break through one of the constraints on the size of your social circles? Right? Because there's a memory capacity, as it seemed to us at the time, or there's a processing capacity. And we didn't know which was important. And we thought, the internet, and Facebook in particular, might provide us access to that because it solves the memory capacity for you. So it's pure processing. Right. It turns out that it doesn't matter what kind of social media you look on, whether it's the telephone, Twitter, Facebook, you name it, anything you want, texting, what have you, you get exactly the same picture in terms of the number of social relationships people have and the layer sizes of the Dunbar graph and the frequencies of contact, exactly the same frequencies of contact with the different people in the different layers. On Facebook, where you're posting to them and phoning them on your phone output, as it were, as if it was face-to-face. No difference at all. So it looks like the internet doesn't really change anything. And everybody goes, well, I've got 1,500 friends on Facebook, and you're telling me I only have 150. And I say, no. In real life, you have up to 5,000. You just call them different things, right? Just because Facebook calls them friends doesn't mean to say they're friends.
Right.
If you look at your postings, you will see the 150 get all your time. And then there's a layer of people that run out to about 500. So that's an extra 350 people.
Right.
And that extra 350 people get very little of your time. I think we calculated it was about 20 seconds per day. Whereas your inner core 5 what we call the shoulders to cry on, for instance, in a layer of 5, each of them gets half an hour a day on average. Right. So you probably don't give them half an hour every day, but over the week you add it up, and each of them is getting 2 or 3 hours of your concentrated time, whereas people in the 500 layer are getting about 20 seconds a day. So it takes quite a few years to build up enough time to
Sure.
spend the evening with them.
Sure.
Right? And there's no point in just saying hi across the street. To establish a relationship, you have to spend significant amount of time with them at one go, right? Go and have dinner with them, go out,
Got it.
in the walk in the park, whatever it may be, takes time. So to accumulate enough time for each of these people takes a lot of time. So it doesn't really change the thing. But what's very illuminating is romantic scams on the internet. And the way this works is the scammers never show you who they are. They won't allow you to meet them. They won't allow you to see who they are
Yeah.
for a long time. And what if they do, they're sending you photographs that are cropped out of model agency kind of things. So these are Greek goddesses and Greek gods, you know. And you're building up this illusion. So you're doing exactly what you do in real life. You're building up this kind of mental image of this person, which is entirely a creation of your own mind. So what you're doing is you're falling in love with an avatar in your own head, not with the person out there. Now, in normal real life, you would meet with them, go out with them, and the shiny gold image would get rubbed off and tarnished by reality, right? The constant reality checks going on, and you're kind of adjusting your image. With scamming, they very, very careful to avoid that happening, right? So they will only finally meet you if they're going to meet you. Once they're absolutely certain that you are so deeply in love with them that no matter what happens, they won't back out of that. And you see it with people that I happen to know somebody who worked on romantic scams on the internet and therefore worked with one of the police forces in England with this. And she said they would go along to somebody's house and knock on the door, as it were, and say, this person you built up this relationship with is scamming you. Here's the evidence that he's a scammer. He's done it before, and it's exactly the same here. And you've been giving him money and all these kind of things. And the person will say, I see yes, you're right. I won't see them again. Said, no, you must absolutely not see them again.
Right.
And she said, a month later, you're knocking on the door again. Said, look, you said you wouldn't see. You've been in contact with them again. Oh yes, but they were so upset that they'd upset me, and they were worried that if they actually showed me who they were, saw me, or send me a true picture of themselves, with all their imperfections that everybody always has, I would not love them anymore, and so I've forgiven him, and you kind of go. You just fall into a trap, but the trap is created by this kind of necessary rosy sunglasses avatar effect, which if we didn't do it, we wouldn't have the courage to go and say, why don't you come out with me? Or I love you. Do you love me?
Yeah.
Because we'd be too embarrassed to do it, right? And so that thing which in the everyday world, and it was designed, if you like, by evolution to work in the everyday face-to-face world, works okay there because you're seeing the person in the village, right? And maybe you've known the person since you were both 2 or 3-year-olds, little kids. So you have some knowledge of them, but also you're building up this relationship through getting to know them and getting to know the real person, as it were. So the interesting question, which I'm sure you're just about to ask me then, is, how do you cope with arranged marriages, right, in this context?
Right.
And the answer is essentially the same, because it's been shown by some guys in America. Until very, very recently, like the last 10 or 15 years, when online dating started to become seriously widespread, 75% of us met our life partner through a member of our social network. That's 150 people.
Right.
So what's happening in there is your circle of friends and maybe family, cousins, brothers, sisters, whatever, not necessarily your parents, are kind of standing surety for you. They've done the checking out. Say, no, this guy's okay.
Right, right. I see what you mean.
He's a friend of a friend of a friend, and all these steps of vouching for him not being, sort of crazy and unreliable. And what you're not getting online is that, of course, but also what's happening in arranged marriages, in some sense, is the families doing that. Now, one argument, everybody says, you've got to fall in love first before you get married to somebody. And the answer seems to be, and certainly sort of when I've asked people who've had arranged marriages, but also I read about it from other people's accounts first, is the answer is you can fall in love after you got married, just
Right.
as easily as before.
Right.
Right? The only difference is who's guaranteeing the appropriateness of this person. They will, they won't cheat on you in whatever way you might not want them to cheat on you. They won't steal your money or whatever. Who's guaranteeing that? And the answer is, either your friends are doing that or the family's doing that
Right.
in some way. And therefore, sort of you can... Life is none of life is nirvana, as I keep saying.
Right.
It's not perfection. You have to make the best
Yeah.
best of it, right?
Yeah.
But which means that not every relationship you get into is going to work out, right? We just make mistakes sometimes. So it looks like the number of, if you like, mistakes marriages that don't work with arranged marriages probably more or less than unarranged marriages, as
Sure.
would normally be the case in the West, as it were. So yes, you pays your money, you takes your choice.
Yeah.
It's a complicated world. Somehow you have to find some way to deal with that complexity to make it work. Otherwise, it's a nightmare, right? And one of the functions that your social network does, and especially your family social network, is they solve that problem for you. You can leave your mother and her sisters to worry about your romantic arrangements.
Right. Sure. I mean, that is super fascinating. Well, Professor Dunbar, it's well over time, so I think I'm gonna start concluding. But I just want to say we covered so much ground. Like we went right from why friendships are important for health and happiness to 150, the Dunbar number, to how you came up with that number and mentalizing abilities. You gave us some tips like laughter and rituals, and I'm going to implement some of that in some of the dinner parties I do and ensure there are only 4 attendees and not 5, so that there's one conversation. But like similarity, homophily, the scientific word for it, and then you also talked about romantic scams and the difference in who's the guarantor. And as you say, nothing in life is nirvana. So lots of key lessons. Is there anything else that you would want to say before we wrap, or is that?
I think we've exhausted life, the universe, and everything.
All right. So thank you once again for joining me, and thank you a lot for your time.
It's a pleasure.